Hello, everyone. This is Jeffrey Kerr. I'm here today with an English Russian Jewish writer who has been a professional classical music critic since the age of 17. Beginning her career at Britain's oldest classical music magazine, Musical Opinion, she has contributed to The Guardian, Bachtrack, MusicOMH, BroadwayWorld, BBC Music Magazine, and Operawire. In 2019, she completed her first literary saga, The Crooked Little Pieces. The series has been published since May 2022. Volume 4 has recently been released. She also spent 12 years profoundly researching the Callas Imprint, a centennial biography which came out to coincide with Maria Callas's 100th birthday last year. Please welcome Sophia Lambton.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, it's a pleasure to welcome you. To start things off, would you mind telling us more about the Callas Imprint?
The CALLAS Imprint, it's got a subheading, a centennial biography, is a work for which I worked for 12 years, starting from when I had just turned 19 years old. The most common question I get about the CALLAS Imprint is why would there be another biography of Maria Callas? And it's a question to which I actually intensely relate because throughout these 12 years, now 13 actually, because the book was published last year, other books have come out about Maria Callas, and that has been my feeling. The problem is generally the books about Maria Callas are split into two categories. They are either very tabloid-like and they want to dramatize her life as much as possible. And usually that involves making her the victim of certain relationships in her life and making villains out of the people to whom she was close. Or they are very academic and they want to take her performances and evaluate them, sometimes using quite dry language, which is not very fun. Some of the more academic biographies are useful in terms of knowledge, but they don't equate you personally, intimately with Maria Callas. So the way the Callas Imprint differs is I take readers in and out of Callas's life, mostly being in her head, using as much of her correspondence as possible, quotes from interviews, but also comparing the two because we want to know how much was she presenting herself in interviews? Was she being awkward? Was she contradicting herself? Because she did actually do that, especially later on in her career when she had problems with her voice. And it's really about juxtaposing the banal and the beautiful. So an example would be following Callas through Luchino Visconti's production of Anna Bolena by Donizetti at La Scala in 1957, which was an extraordinarily beautiful production by Visconti, the film director. Obviously, the story of Anne Boleyn, who was famously beheaded by her husband, Henry VIII. I've described that performance. I describe review quotes, so you get a sense of being there, you get a sense of being Callas, and there's a recording of it, which I described to a point. And then she comes off stage, and her colleague, the mezzo Giulietta Simeonato, says, "Oh, Maria, you were magnificent." And she says, "Baloney, I was in a trance." And that is the kind of juxtaposition I never saw in either documentaries or biographies of Callas. The idea that she is a human being, she is vulnerable, but she has an extraordinary gift. Unfortunately, with the exception of my book, works about her, detailed works about her, have really either wanted to focus on the personal and sadly from a rather sleazy angle, or they have been very academic and they haven't really considered Callas too much as a character or sometimes even actually the whole of her contribution to her art.
And what inspired you to write the book?
I was inspired because I had a revelation when I was 17. I had known about Maria Callas since the age of 7. And when I was 17, I started listening to her interviews, and her interviews were nothing like what I would have expected. So I thought, oh, Maria Callas was this diva, this prima donna. She had this big dramatic life. In other words, I was distancing myself from Callas. I thought she was this great gift, but I don't particularly want to read about her because she sounds like this high maintenance, entitled diva. And I couldn't have been more wrong. I was entirely wrong. And the more I listened to interviews and then eventually read interviews and found some reliable material and some biographies, because most biographies do have their own share of reliable sources, the more I realized this woman was unknown to the public. She was not known. Her voice was known. So my impression was that even a very fervent Callas lover could be listening to a recording and feeling so much empathy, and yet then kind of distancing themselves from the real person, thinking, well, I don't want to know about her. You know, there was that stuff with Onassis, and she was probably really dramatic and not a pleasant person or not a relatable person. My main goal was to tell people this is a relatable woman. She's not just someone you can listen to. She's someone you can relate to, someone you can identify with. This is a woman who did not want applause to happen after particular arias because she said it wasn't important. She said it was, distracting from her reality on stage when she was in a role. This was a woman who didn't like the showpiece aria Vici d'arte from Tosca because she said it didn't make dramatic sense. She read Puccini's letters and she said Puccini himself admitted he'd only included it as a highlight for the soprano, but it didn't make sense to her from the point of view of the suspense and the tension and the plot of the opera. So this was not somebody who was all about presenting herself. On the contrary, this was an artist who, I would say, like all of the greatest artists, was all about what can I contribute to this giant field of opera? And she sacrificed herself. She worked crazily. She would extend rehearsals until 3:30 a.m. She endangered her health. You could definitely argue there were times when she had lethally low blood pressure and she would go out on stage anyway because she didn't want to disappoint her public. She went to some crazy lengths to try to improve her voice when she was having vocal problems. At one point, she apparently drank a tumbler of castor oil during the 1960 recording of Norma, and that's the one that's most frequently heard when we hear her Casta Diva. This was someone who was a contributor to art. This wasn't someone who wanted to create a cult around herself. Now, she was so great that a cult was created, but that doesn't mean that she was self-important or dictatorial. On the contrary, she was oftentimes humble. She had a lot of self-loathing as an artist because she always felt she wasn't giving enough.
Yeah, and how familiar were you with Maria Callas prior to this? And you've mentioned you've been familiar with her since you were 7.
Yeah, I was 7 when I was going to school and I passed a train station that had a little billboard with a commercial it was a poster for one of those essential Maria Callas albums, which really goes to show how things have changed because I'm 31 now. So that was 24 years ago. Unfortunately, I can't imagine a Maria Callas album being promoted at a train station or even as a TV spot on TV. Or probably even in a YouTube ad, frankly. But yes, I knew about her when I was 7. And then when I was 13, my father, who had always loved classical music, gave me my first opera album. And that was Leontine Price's Carmen. And he then introduced me to Callas. And I was one of those people who did not like Callas's voice at first because I felt I had to get used to it. But thankfully, that happened quite quickly. So I was listening to Callas a lot by the time I was 14, 15, 16. And it wasn't until I was 17 that I really I should say really, I started to meet the real Maria Callas because I think anybody who is that interesting and complex takes a really long time to try to figure out. So it was quite a journey. I feel like I've known many different Maria Callases because it's been so long.
And of all the research you did for the book, were there any interesting facts that surprised you most?
Yeah, I would say the surprise to me, it sounds like a pretty basic thing to say about someone as famous as Callas, but the level of her being a workaholic was insane. As I've already mentioned, is really about what she wanted to bring to the stage. She wanted to ensure that a performance had the best direction. So she at one point recruited the Greek film director Alexis Minotis to direct her Medea. And he didn't even want to do it. He was the film director. He said, I don't like opera. And she said, well, so much the better. I prefer film directors like you and Franco Zeffirelli and Jean Vilar. She actually would frequently bring her own costumes. I found correspondence from her manager, Sandra Gorlinsky, telling the Royal Opera House she wants to bring her own costumes. She thinks they're better. She would do her own makeup because she had various skin allergies and acne. So she felt it was better that way. She would deliberate with conductors which cuts to make to an opera, because quite a few operas, especially from the mid-19th century, are very long. So traditionally cuts are made. She would attend orchestral rehearsals, even though singers aren't expected to. She would even contribute to the set design. So as part of that Medea in 1958 that Alexis Minotis directed, she actually gave details. She gave feedback. She said she didn't want as Medea to come out of the temple in her chariot, that she wanted the temple to crumble around Medea and be standing there as Medea with her children slain. So this is someone who is meticulously obsessed with trying to create the most beautiful experience, the most cathartic experience for the audience that she can. And sometimes, as I touched on earlier, to the detriment of her own, shall we say, prestige, because actually she didn't like Vicidarte. She actually had an argument with Herbert von Karajan when he repeated the sextet from Lucia de Lammermoor, because she said it doesn't make dramatic sense. So you're confusing the audience. They actually had a conflict for a while and were ironically reunited by Aristotle Onassis. He reconciled them years later. There's that. And then there's also the extent to which this workaholism diminishes her interest in other things. So first of all, I, like very many other people, imagined Maria Callas was this romantic operatic heroine who was deeply in love with her husband and then deeply in love with Aristotle Onassis. And while she did love both, I would say overall that she loved them a lot less than I assumed. That's what my research and especially reading her letters really led me to believe more and more as time went on and as my research continued. Generally, other topics were not of great interest to her. So, for instance, she wasn't a big reader. Beverly Sills said that when she asked Callas about reading, Callas apparently said she was too fidgety to read. I know that Callas read opera-based or opera-related works. So she read the letters of Puccini. She read biographies of 19th century prima donnas like Maria Malibran and Pauline Viardot. And she read Alexandre Dumas Fis's La Dame aux Camélias, so The Lady of the Camellias, which is the basis for La Traviata. She wasn't a big film buff, for instance. She loved Laurence Olivier and she loved the film of Wuthering Heights, but I would say she wasn't the most educated person. But when it came to contributing to opera production, she did know her stuff and she wanted it to be as sublime as possible.
Are you familiar with Terrence McNally's 1995 award-winning stage play Masterclass?
Yes, I have seen it 1.5 times because the second time I left, I won't tell you who was playing Callas when I left, but I will say I saw Stephanie Beacham as Callas and I saw Tyne Daly as Callas. And even though those two women are very good actresses, I personally don't think any actress will ever be able to play Maria Callas. I think it is too specific a character and there's too great a risk of turning her into a caricature. I would also like to add, for anyone who's listening and has seen Masterclass, the real Juilliard Masterclasses, which make up, I think, probably my second favorite period of Callas's life, were completely different. Firstly, because she was an incredibly supportive coach, and she didn't even like to call herself a teacher or coach. When you listen to the audio recordings of those sessions, she says, no, I'm not a teacher, I'm not a teacher. So she's kind of providing this after hours clinic, so it's more like an assistant. That's the way she sees herself. But she really tried to support and help these students. She was friends with one of them, Barry Smith, to the extent that when I reached out to Barry Smith about 12 years ago, Barry Smith was writing a book about her friendship with Callas, but sadly Smith passed away before that came into fruition. She wrote to Lawrence Kelly, who was general manager of the Dallas Opera, to recommend tenor Mario Fusco. That was one of her students. She offered to another tenor, Marco Lampas, the opportunity to stay at her flat in Paris so that he could look around for engagements in France. She would talk to these students, and hopefully some of your listeners might like to listen to the classes on YouTube, because all of them are on YouTube, the real Juilliard classes. She would talk to the students almost as equals, as fellow singers. So at one point, Sheila Nadler, mezzo-soprano, who was older than most of the other students, said, I feel like I'm making a comeback. And Callas said, well, so do I. We're in the same boat. And frequently you hear her be very disparaging about her own voice because she's demonstrating to the students how to sing a phrase. And then she will kind of say, well, I'm not in a voice today. So there is a tremendous humility about it that is at odds with Terrence McNally's representation. I understand why someone, Terrence McNally, rest in peace, was a very good dramatist. By itself, it's not a bad play, but it has nothing to do with reality. In my first ever interview about Callas, so my first ever interview with somebody who knew Callas, that was Janine Reiss, who was a very famous French vocal coach who passed away 2 or 3 years ago. She said she went to see French actress Fanny Ardant as Callas in a French adaptation in Paris. And unfortunately, Janine Reiss was so sickened by this fictitious portrayal of her friend that she actually threw up during intermission in the bathroom. That was one of the first things Janine Reiss told me, because I was coming to her as a 19-year-old back then, a 19-year-old potential Callas biographer, and she didn't trust me. And I completely understand why she didn't trust me, because she basically started telling me, well, I've seen these inaccurate portraits of my dear friend, and they've been really upsetting. And they've been upsetting to me too, because it doesn't help Callas's legacy. So, of course, whether it's an inaccurate biography or whether it's a fictional portrait, I guess the readers or viewers can have fun, but I don't think it's adding to their knowledge of Maria Callas.
Yeah, and I've never seen or read the play myself, although as someone who happens to be a descendant of Greek immigrants, that's the most familiarity I've always had with Maria Callas.
Yeah. Well, Callas was Greek, but she was more of the citizen of the world on some level because she liked to accentuate whatever country she was in. So she would say, I feel an affinity with Greeks because they're my blood, but she would say, well, I live in Italy, so I'm Italian. And she liked to court different publics that way. It was quite endearing, actually. Yeah, the play is unfortunately unrelated to the real Maria Callas.
Yeah, and there were even previous attempts at film adaptation of the play, like Faye Dunaway, who did it on stage, tried to get one off the ground not only as the star but also director. Then HBO announced their plans to do so with Mike Nichols at the helm and Meryl Streep in the starring role, yet neither of those ever materialized, so I guess maybe it's cursed.
I don't know if it's cursed. I mean, I've heard about how many actresses have done this play. There was Zoe Caldwell, right? And
Oh
there was
yeah,
didn't Patti LuPone do a masterclass at some point?
I know Zoe Caldwell originated it on stage and won the Tony.
I'm not a theatre critic, so it's not really my place to judge its quality as a play. But just as a kind of layperson theatre goer, I guess it's entertaining. It's just very unfortunate that Terence McNally wanted to use Callas's name and try to present the moment, because I say this as a novelist as well. I'm a novelist primarily, and I'm a classical music critic, but there is definitely always a temptation to take from real life. But at the same time, you risk presenting something as truth when it's not. And that doesn't sit well with me. It's not something I would personally do, even though I understand the temptation.
And yes, Patti LuPone did take over for Zoe Caldwell in Masterclass on Broadway, although Dixie Carter actually closed out the original run.
Oh, right. No, I had forgotten about Dixie Carter. Okay.
One thing I'll add is that I remember hearing on a podcast, someone was saying this was in response to complaints they had with, historical inaccuracies in movies like Braveheart and The Greatest Showman, saying, look, if you want to approach this story something completely original, that's perfectly fine, but the fact that it's related to history almost feels like a slap in the face.
Yeah, I think nowadays, I think it's so easy you can make up a composite of opera singers. So all you have to do is use a fictional name. And to be perfectly honest, I think Terence McNally could have given this character a completely fictional name and borrowed details, up to and including even, the soprano had a famous relationship with a Greek billionaire, and probably people would have inferred that Maria Callas was being implied, but it wouldn't have seemed like such a biographical portrait. And that way he could have been using details of her life without, the risk of people going home and thinking, oh, I didn't know that this happened when actually such a thing hadn't happened in real life.
Now, among the many films gaining Oscar buzz this season is Maria, a biographical film about Maria Callas, starring Angelina Jolie, directed by Pablo Larraín, who previously did Jackie and Spencer. And the story is set during her final years in the 1970s when she was living in Paris. It's already premiered at festivals and will open in select theaters on November 27th, before debuting on Netflix on December 11th. And you've already mentioned your personal doubts in seeing a proper portrayal of Maria Callas in really any media, but what are your thoughts on the upcoming movie?
I should say, I don't know when this will be released, but we're in early October now, so I haven't seen the film because I haven't been to the festivals at which it has played. So I can't speak of the entire script. I've only seen a trailer and I've read many reviews, but I would like to tell anyone out there who is considering watching it that it is, at least on the basis of what I've seen and read already, it seems to be grossly inaccurate. So firstly, as I mentioned earlier, there was truly nothing entitled about Maria Callas. I've seen in the trailer, this character says, give me a reservation at a restaurant where everyone knows me, I'm in the mood for adulation. That is the absolute opposite of Callas, especially in that period, but generally also in life. She moved to Paris, as she wrote to one of her lawyers, Augusto Caldi Scalcini. She moved to Paris to actually move away from the press and be less hype. She said, here they respect your peace. I read in a review that this character says, "Get me a hairdresser who doesn't speak." Well, again, that is the total opposite. Maria Callas famously did speak actually to several hairdressers, including Alexandre Raymond. He was known as Alexandre de Paris. She gifted him a silver crucifix that she had been given by the president of Nigeria. And he mentioned how she loved discussing music with him, and they would have conversations at length. And there was another hairdresser, Frédéric Simonier, in Paris as well, who would record conversations with Callas. That's, again, the total opposite. Other details, and these details are unfortunately very often reported inaccurately. People think Maria Callas cheated on her husband with Aristotle Onassis. This is not true. Maria Callas actually, as multiple different sources show, was not a very sexual being, and she was actually very close to her husband, and she loved him very dearly. He actually left her. Her husband left her, coincidentally, at the same time that she was becoming friends with Onassis. The reason her husband, Giovanni Battista Meneghini, left her was because he had basically been her manager. She found out he had improperly invested their mutual funds, so which were mostly her funds because she was making the money as an opera singer, and he had given up. He had been the manager of a brick manufacturing business, but he'd given it up to be her manager. She found out they had lost a lot of money because he'd invested in forgeries, in fake paintings, so forgeries. And she consulted her new friend Onassis for advice. Meneghini got suspicious. She said, "There's no reason to be suspicious." She said, "Will you let me manage my own career since you've made this mistake?" He said no, and he left her. And then he was so bitter at her that he started making up this story that she and Onassis were lovers. Now, they would eventually become lovers, but that was months later. And he was the one who, first of all, actually created a fictional story that they had been lovers during that marriage, which is untrue. Not only that, but as a correspondence between Callas and her lawyer, Augusto Calvi Scalcini, reveals, and this is new correspondence that I found, this lawyer's grandson in Turin, Italy. So her husband Meneghini, I say husband because at the time divorce in Italy was still illegal, so she couldn't get a divorce from him, even when they were separated. He would try to blackmail her, and he would say, "Onassis needs to give me $1 million or else I'm going to go to the press again with the story about this affair." To the extent that at some point she actually recorded their conversation, and she told her lawyer to tell his lawyer that if he continued blackmailing her, she would give that recording to the press. She had nothing to hide at that point. She had nothing to hide. There have been quite a few dramatic stories suggested about this period. The truth is actually, you could say it's a less dramatic truth. Her husband made a terrible investment. They had an argument. He left. He was bitter that she then spent time with Onassis. He made up a story, which is untrue, a fictitious story about an adulterous affair, and started trying to blackmail her with this threat that he was going to go to the press, which he did many times. And unfortunately, people still think that's true when it's not. In addition, just as a final point, because this is another, to be frank, as far as I can tell from the reviews I've read of this film, almost everything in it seems fictional, except for the actual names of Maria Callas and her butler Ferruccio and her maid Bruna. Callas also left Onassis 4 months before he married Jacqueline Kennedy. He did not leave her. She left him 4 months before that. Not only that, but she told various friends. And there were actually already reports in the press of this. So it's funny that people continuously to this day still say, "Oh, Onassis left Callas for Jackie." No, even a few press reports from the period in August 1968 were picking up that they had split. She left him on about the 20th of July, 68, and she told a friend who was her former secretary, Teresa D'Adato, in a letter that she had left that relationship. Those are just some of the details that this movie, as far as I can tell from having read reviews and seen the trailer, gets wrong. So there is a lot wrong, but to be honest, the most hurtful thing for me is this representation of Callas as a diva when she absolutely categorically was not.
When it comes to historical accuracy in narrative fiction, it's important to stay true to the facts as much as possible while still creating something that can be dramatically interesting. Where do you stand on that?
This is a very interesting question because there's a response as a historian and there's a response as a novelist. So as a historian, I'm not really a historian, but you can call me Callas historian because I did do a lot of research for that. So as a Callas historian and as a biographer, I don't see the need for narrative fiction generally. Or shall we say, I see the need for narrative fiction where there is a lot of mystery. You can make stuff up and there's a lot to be left to the imagination, such as the opera Anne Boleyn about Anne Boleyn. I think if we're dealing with figures from early modern history, or at least figures who haven't been on film, figures who weren't photographed, I think, yeah, it's exciting to imagine a movie star in that role or an actor in that role on screen or on stage. But I don't see the value either from an artistic viewpoint and definitely not from a historical viewpoint of making films about figures who were widely filmed, such as Callas, such as Marilyn Monroe, such as Billie Holiday, such as, not to mention far more recently, Whitney Houston and Amy Winehouse. I don't get it, because who wants to see, no matter how good the actor is, who would rather watch an actor lip sync or even attempt to sing like a very, very great singer compared to watching the real singer on YouTube? So nowadays, when so many great artists of the past, both the distant past and the more recent past, are so accessible on YouTube to, anyone with a smartphone or a smart TV or a laptop or an iPad, I don't see what those kinds of biopics are bringing viewers artistically. In terms of narrative fiction in general, I definitely stick to the idea that it's really only interesting and exciting if there is a lot unknown about the person treated in the work of narrative fiction. I don't think that applies to people who have been alive far more recently, especially if there are hours and hours of interviews with them on YouTube and hours and hours of performances with them available to their fans.
Yeah, oh yeah, and of course there's always documentaries offering the real story.
Absolutely. Good documentary can tell you, can really introduce you to the person. Whereas I don't know what a biopic can do, to be honest. I haven't watched that many. Whereas something like Amadeus, about Mozart, even though it's probably fictional, that makes more sense because obviously there's no photography of Mozart, there's no film footage of Mozart. But when it comes to people that either you or I or people older than us grew up with, that's odd. It almost feels like an attempt to change what we know of the figures
Huh.
represented.
No, I guess watch Tarantino make his own Maria Callas biopic.
Oh gosh. Yeah. I never saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So I
Oh,
don't know how historically accurate that was, but yeah,
oh,
you did remind me of it.
well, what about Glorious Bastards?
Oh right, that's right. Yeah. See, I'm not a Tarantino person, so I'm not too informed about that.
Well, yeah, I understand how his style isn't for everyone, but going back to the beginning, how did you first get started in writing?
I basically had a really happy childhood, and that, at least for me, that was everything. So I had really loving parents, and that meant that I was free to think about whatever I wanted. I say this because I think if you're a kid who has problems for whatever reason, whether in the family or at school, then I guess maybe you're an anxious kid or you're a fearful kid. I had an amazing childhood, which meant that I was living in my own world for pretty much all the time. So I started writing when I was 5, obviously not very seriously, but I was writing, they were kind of like fake plays, fake because originally the first things I wrote, I think, they were plays around Harry Potter characters. So that was when I was 12. I remember that. And then eventually I started writing plays properly, real plays, when I was 14. And it took me a while to realize I wanted to use so much detail. There was no way I was going to fit it into a play because my first ever play, I think it would have maybe been 7 hours if it had ever been staged. So I was obviously not a playwright, but it took me a while to realize I was not a playwright.
And you've also written a literary saga, The Crooked Little Pieces. How did the idea for that come about?
I think it came about because I was growing into a prolific reader when I was about 12. But at the same time, I'm a millennial. So I was raised on a lot of TV. And I remember, this might sound embarrassing, but when I was 12, I really loved Desperate Housewives. I remember reading about how the writers would create an A plot, a B plot, a C plot, and a D plot. Even at the age of 12, when I wasn't really that much of a writer then, I wanted to do that. I wanted to write a TV series as a novel. And that happened organically for me because I tend to get really attached to characters. So The Crooked Little Pieces is basically a television drama that has been novelized, which means that we see a lot of the drama from the character's perspective. It's about twin sisters, Annalise and Isabel. We follow them from when they're 6 in 1925 up to 1972 across 7 volumes. 4 of them have been published. The 5th is published next year. It's really my attempt to give a literary TV series to the public because that's what I've always wanted to do. I've had attachments to fictional characters. I will admit, I think there is something especially powerful about an attachment to a TV character, especially if you're watching it year after year. So nowadays, people don't tend to do that with old series. But even month after month, seeing the same character so often, seeing that character evolve, brings you a kind of relationship that a standalone novel or even a movie does not. And that is what I want to do with my readers through my fiction, because I tend to gravitate towards sagas. I have written one standalone novel, but it's really bad, so I'm not going to publish it.
Can you see the Crooked Little Pieces getting adapted into a TV series or another medium?
That was always my dream. The further I go in my writing, the more scenic I make the scenes. So one of the most important lessons for me as a writer was realizing you don't have to start at the beginning. I was being quite silly earlier on when I was about 14. I think I tried to write some kind of novel when I was 14, shortly after I'd finished my first play. And I was being impatient. I was finding it boring because I thought you had to start it off introducing people, saying, oh, so-and-so was 34. She'd been living in London for so long. Definitely 20th century literature has shown you don't have to do that. It has shown that you can start in medias res, but also cinema and TV have shown that perhaps even more often by virtue of flashbacks and flash forwards and these narrative devices that don't appear in literature that often even today.
Well, yeah, and as someone who happens to be an aspiring scriptwriter, I've seen a video explaining an idea of how exposition can work effectively in film. One example they list is how to withhold information, meaning you don't
Yeah.
have to give all the information out right away.
I absolutely agree. A lot of literature nowadays actually is very guilty of that. So I feel when I pick up a modern novel, I feel like it's very behind cinema and TV, which is funny because, I mean, it used to be thought that cinema and TV were inferior to literature. For a long time, that was the belief of many intellectuals and scholars. And now I feel a lot of literature is very inferior to a few TV series at least. And your reason is precisely one of them. I am very anti-exposition, and that's something I have had to realize as a writer. There's not much point in giving all the information away to the reader.
Now, many novels are seeking adaptations more in television as opposed to movies because, in
Yeah.
television, you don't have to make as many compromises to the story.
Yeah, that absolutely. I mean, it's funny. I read Brideshead Revisited a few months ago, but I hadn't seen the BBC adaptation, but it's a mini series. And I would say plot-wise, Brideshead Revisited isn't the most dramatic novel. It is interesting that it got adapted into a miniseries even, I think it was the late 80s, even back when there was a lot less TV. But you're absolutely right. A cinema to me is more like a novella or a relatively long short story film to me. It's more like a novella or short story. I do think novels have more in common with TV series in general, even when they are standalones, because they take the reader on a more intimate journey and on a longer journey.
And for those who'd like to pursue a career in writing, where do you think would be a good place to start?
I think definitely the first thing you have to do is figure out who you are. Recently, a fellow writer, when I was asking him, what do you write? He said, when I get asked that, he said, I feel like saying I'm a writer is like saying I cook food. So, and it's true. Writers are so wildly different, and it can be very tempting for us to reject different styles because we're insecure about our own style. Really, there is so much you can do, and there is so much more you can do, I would say, as a writer compared to if you're a film director. Nowadays, most directors use digital, but in the past they had to use film. They had to make sure that there was enough film. They had to make sure certain scenes were filmed within a very restricted amount of time. We have so much liberty as writers. The first thing you really need to do is figure out what kind of writer you are, because you don't have to be a particular genre. And even if you decide you want to write a novel, you don't have to structure it in a similar way to your favorite writers, let alone to whoever you think are the great writers. Because I see a lot of that. There are a few, writing forums online, people saying, well, I've read in a writing class I should be doing this and not that. Who on earth knows what you should really be doing other than using, preferably correct spelling and grammar and punctuation and having a structure that makes some kind of sense? And even then, structure that makes sense. How does James Joyce's Ulysses make structural sense? It's just a giant progress of it's a giant journey of discovery. In terms of career-wise, I'd say so I'm 31, I'm not Gen Z. I think there's a risk that some Gen Zers might think I've got to get my writing out there very early. The moment you post something online, even on Instagram or X or Facebook, although not many young people use Facebook, but the moment you put something out there, consider it done. So I'm saying that because maybe you don't want to put it out there. Maybe you still feel you're developing as a writer. There's no rush, basically. There's no rush, and that's probably the greatest fortune we as writers have, because singers tend to, singers risk their voices degenerating later on. Dancers tend to have relatively short careers. Even actors, not their acting may remain as good or improve, but they tend to be offered fewer roles. We have a lot of time compared to the other artists in the arts. So take your time and only put out there, if you're really going to share something online, whether it's through an ebook or just a blog, make sure you feel it really represents you and you feel it's ready. Don't feel pressure to put something out there just because other people are doing it. You don't know where they are in their careers or how confident they are. Spend time finding out who you are. So that's pretty much what any artist should be doing, but especially writers, because we have the immense luxury of time.
And before we go, do you have any upcoming projects that you'd like to share with us?
As I mentioned before, the 5th volume of the Crooked Little Pieces comes out next year. It'll be September. In the meantime, the first 4 volumes are all available. I recorded interviews for a documentary about Callas that will air on BBC Two. That's for the UK listeners out there. I've been told at Christmas, but unfortunately I don't have a particular date yet. That should be a good documentary because the people with whom I collaborated were really willing to portray Callas in a genuine and empathetic way. So there's an ongoing thing I have for any artists out there listening. I actually have a little community. It's called the Artistic Minority Underground. And the reason it's called the Artistic Minority Underground is because it's a community for artists who are obsessed with aesthetics and hard work. So it's not a community for artists who are using it basically to show off, to put it bluntly. We get together once a month on Zoom. There are no obligations. You don't have to come every time. We basically just hang out and we talk about films and music and books. And it's really fun. It's like a support group for artists, but it's different to social media because I'm not a social media person. I never have been. You're not putting anything out there in the public. Obviously the meetings are private. You can even use a pseudonym if you prefer. You can feel free to talk about anything you want. There are no obligations, there are no restrictions. Basically, it's just a support group. So if you are interested, if you go to the crepuscularpress.com/the, so THE, and then -AMU, it'll tell you where you can reach out to me to join. Because so far we're meeting once monthly, but there aren't that many of us. But I have been looking to expand. Artists of any stripes, if you feel like you dedicate your life to art, then come and join us, whatever you're doing.
Sophia, I thank you very much for devoting your time to this conversation. It was great getting to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
And for those who'd like to keep up with your career, where can people find you on the internet? And you just mentioned you're not on social media.
Yeah, I'm personally not, but my books are. So I do have access to social media accounts because I'm a private person. They're not in my name. So it's the Crepuscular Press on Instagram, TikTok. I've got to say, TikTok is very rarely consulted, but Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest, Facebook. But if someone actually wants to reach out to me personally, if that person goes to the crepuscularpress.com, there's an email address at the bottom of the homepage, or they can just go to the contact section because I'm much likely to reply promptly in that case if they reach out personally rather than through any of the social media channels.
Thanks again for joining me today, Sophia. This was great.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeffrey.